Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Gary. Can you confirm that you can hear me and
Yep.
see my slides?
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. Always happy to talk with DMF and the DMF community. I kind of wish we were doing this in person, but hopefully sooner than later we can do that as well. I should acknowledge my partners in crime, Lisa Kerr and Mackenzie Mazur. Some of what I'll be presenting was done in collaboration with them at the Kofomi Research Institute. So Gary gave a bit of an introduction, and I know many of you, but I don't know some of you. So as an introduction or a reintroduction, I'm currently a professor of fisheries oceanography at the UMass School for Marine Science Technology. My research and teaching is largely associated with stock assessment, but also the science policy interface, giving advice to fisheries managers. And one aspect of my work has been spatial structure, spatial modeling, spatial assessment. Before this, as Gary said, I was a stock assessment scientist in Woods Hole from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center from the late 90s, early 2000s. And before that, with the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, way back, started in '88. So long history here with the division and with groundfish and stock assessments in this region. So today I thought I'd give kind of a light pass on what's up with groundfish. And, you know, it's a pretty heavy topic and it's got a lot of economic implications. And there are some major problems. This light pass isn't meant at all to not take those things seriously, but to try to, you know, get a large view on what's been happening and where we are right now. Need to start with history with groundfish. It's been, you know, the fishery's been happening for some of these stocks for hundreds of years. So that's important context, and even the recent decades of history and what's been happening. More recently, concerns about underreported catch, some changes in productivity, and the meat of what I'll be showing is some management strategy evaluations to try to confront these problems and try to develop robust stock assessments and harvest strategies. So starting out with history, I mean, we have reminders all around us from the Gloucester fishermen, memorializing the schooner fishermen who fished for groundfish in the offshore banks, the sacred cod that's hanging from our state house, because so many of the coastal communities in Massachusetts were really built on cod and other groundfish, and Mass DMF seal with the cod on it. I know Paul Diodati tried to get that switched to a striped bass, but the cod there is really significant of the history of groundfish in the region. Really going into the recent history, the mid-90s are when all the principal groundfish stocks, so those were cod, haddock, yellowtail, flounder. We used to manage the groundfish complex according to these three principal stocks, assessing those and managing the fishery for those, but also recognizing that there are about 20 stocks in the groundfish fleet. But in the mid-90s, those principal stocks were all considered to be collapsed. And the management advice was for essentially no targeted fishing. And this is about the time that I started getting involved in groundfish assessments. I was still working with DMF, they're working on the trawl survey. And so I guess part of the problem for the last 30 years has been it's my fault. I may have a lot to blame for this current condition of groundfish, and definitely feel accountable for some of the scientific problems that are causing some management problems. So, you know, this looks pretty negative as far as the mid-90s, these three principal stocks of groundfish, but there was a lot of management action that happened after that. And, you know, we think of a success story like scallops, where in the mid-90s, they were having some of the same low stock problems, but partly because of groundfish closed areas, partly because of regulations on the scallop fishery, they rebuilt, you know, kind of as expected, if not more than expected, from this reduction in fishing and fishing regulations. And it's been, you know, a success story where it's an economic success, it's a fishery success, It's a market success. And so the reductions in fishing in the late 90s really promoted rebuilding and achieved our management objectives. If we take a similar look at groundfish, from a distance, we actually see similar things. In the mid 90s, when those same closed areas that helped scallops were closed, reduced the groundfish days at sea, mesh size increases, a whole series of management changes, there was an increase in the spawning stock biomass. So this is all of the analytical groundfish assessments stacked up, and we see an increase in the late 90s. Then it starts to dip down a bit, but then there was the reauthorized Magnuson Act that mandated annual catch limits in all fisheries. With accountability in the groundfish plan, they transitioned from a days at sea system to a catch share system with allocation of catch to sectors, and that promoted further rebuilding. But if we drill down into which stocks are supporting that rebuilding, it's really only a few. It's the redfish, pollock, and both haddock stocks are really driving what appears to be a rebuilding of the groundfish stocks. The flounders and cods are not really contributing. In fact, they're going in the other direction. So it's really different stories depending on different species in the groundfish complex. If we look at the ones that are doing well, redfish around the mid 90s, when we had those restrictions, the population really responded. Pollock also responded in the late 90s. There was a down dip, and then after the sector system increased, and the same thing with both of our haddock stocks, with some initial rebuilding in the 90s, and then coincident with the shift to sectors, really superlative recruitment, strong recruitment, and the highest stock sizes we've seen, since the 30s for Georges Bank. So for these stocks, management has worked well, but not all of the groundfish have responded like that. So there's really been a failure to rebuild for Gulf of Maine cod, which is among the lowest stock size in the series, Georges Bank cod, which is the lowest stock size in the series. These are just the assessments that were developed earlier this year, and continued overfishing. Even though there's been decreases in the fishing mortality for Georges cod and for Gulf of Maine cod, we're still right about the overfishing limit, despite very low catches because of low stocks. Even those low catches are in an overfishing state. And so with these flounder stocks and cod stocks that are not rebuilding, it really causes a challenge in the sector management system. Again, since 2010, each sector gets allocated some catch of every groundfish stock, but the low allocations of the cods and the flounders really constrain the ability of sectors to catch their full allocations of these healthy stocks like pollock, haddock, and redfish. So looking at the last year catch, pollock, the most recent estimate was only 7% of the pollock allocation was caught in 2020. For Georges Bank haddock, Western Georges Bank, only 6% was caught, 11% of Eastern Georges Bank haddock. Gulf of Maine haddock's a little bit better, but still less than half of the allocation was caught, and redfish as well, 41% of the allocation caught. Primarily because of the constraints of catching other groundfish like cod and flounder along with them. We got the redfish uptake is as good as it is because of efforts like RedNet. So kudos here to Pingo He, Mike Pohl from SMAST and DMF, this partnership, along with partnership with the fishermen and other scientists, really refined targeting of redfish to be almost pure redfish, working with the mesh sizes and the gear, the fishing times and fishing areas, trying to achieve the optimum yield of RedNet and move the fleet away from depleted stocks and onto these healthy stocks. So to resolve these choke species issues, we really need to do more like this to allow clean targeting of the healthy stocks. But we also need to focus on the choke stocks themselves that have not been rebuilding. And so, the reasons why cod and flounders haven't been rebuilding, similar to haddock and pollock and redfish, it's unknown, but it appears to be a combination of unreported catch, changes in productivity, the way those affect stock assessment, and the way that affects management. So kind of a combination of factors, which is leading to this problem with choke stocks. And so really setting up the problem of underreported catch. Working in Massachusetts or New Bedford, you've probably heard of Carlos Rafael, the codfather. He was convicted of selling choke stocks like cod and yellowtail flounder, gray sole, dabs as haddock in 2015-16. There was a high allocation of haddock, but these choke stocks were misreported as haddock. That's a problem for our sector management because, monitoring the catch of sectors in season assumes that our dealer reports are accurate. And then in turn, our stock assessments also assume that we have a census of the commercial landings from, now we have weekly electronic dealer reports, and we rely on that as a census of landings. And so when we have this underreported catch, it can mess up our management so that we're not achieving our avoiding overfishing goals or rebuilding goals. And it can also really have an impact on the stock assessment when we assume that we're accounting for all of that commercial landings. There's another aspect of catch bias, and that's what we call the observer effect. Our management and our assessments assume that the observed trips, the trips that we send an observer out on, represent the unobserved trips for estimating discarded catch. But we recognize that high lease prices of choke stocks really incentivize the discarding of legal-sized groundfish on unobserved trips. So for some situations, it's more expensive for a fisherman to land a cod than it is to discard a cod because he may not have cod allocation. He may need to lease allocation in order to land that cod. So certainly setting up incentives for illegal discarding. And then looking at the characteristics of observed trips, the Groundfish Plan Development Team found that they were significantly shorter during the sector management period, and they have less catch of groundfish. So there's at least circumstantial evidence that there's been different fishing behavior with and without observers. And Amendment 23 of the Groundfish Plan was formed to try to address this issue, to improve the catch accounting through higher observer coverage, through electronic monitoring, and in several approaches to try to improve the estimation of catch, both in season for sector management, as well as for end of the year for stock assessments and accurate removals. So the other part of the problem is climate impacts. For several of the groundfish, we've seen changes in productivity consistent with climate change. Despite extremely low catch limits, several stocks are not rebuilding as we expected them to when we assume historical productivity. Southern New England, just starting from south to north, is an example where in the Southern New England Mid-Atlantic, there's been increasing water temperatures. So this is from the State of the Ecosystem report that the center puts out. And really in recent years, during those warmer years, have not seen any strong recruitment from yellowtail for the last 30 years. And so recognizing that is that, we used to have a productive fishery, but really not removing much Southern New England yellowtail. But the reduced productivity is as much from poor recruitment from Mother Nature than it is from fishing too much. So as a result of this, the rebuilding target was lowered to account for this lower productivity. So that the scientific system has recognized this change in productivity for that stock. Moving a little further north, the Georges Bank stocks of cod and yellowtail Again, removing very little catch, or at least our best estimates of catch are very low, but the cod stock still declines. For Georges Bank yellowtail, which was removing about 15,000 tons a year, and the most recent assessment, they're measuring catch in kilograms. So really not removing many yellowtail, but the survey indices keep declining. When we look at some of the causes for this, I don't think we have to look very far. We can start looking at the bottom temperature. So here are two plots from the NIPS fall bottom trawl survey from the 60s and from recent years. And, we've got a warming of up to 4 degrees centigrade warmer in recent years. If anyone who's held groundfish in the lab know that for species like yellowtail, about 10C is about when they start dropping off. Historically, that wasn't really a problem. It was really just up on the shoals of the bank that you got in the fall, you got temperatures that warm. But more recently, most of the bank is that temperature, and some much warmer, warmer than what are listed as some of the lethal limits for some of these species. So again, I don't think we need to search very far for a mechanism for decreased productivity. We've had extreme warming on Georges Bank. And the most extreme warming we've had is a little further north in the Gulf of Maine. When we look at the rate of global warming around the world, the Gulf of Maine's warming faster than 99% of other areas of the ocean. And so again, with very low reduction, over the, this 4 or 5 year period, catch was reduced by 95%, but really not much recovery going on from the stock. And for Gulf of Maine cod, we do have some estimates from tagging that suggest that natural mortality is higher than it was historically. So natural mortality is an important part of productivity, and that appears to be increasing, coincident with this warming water temperature. So what effect does that have on our stock assessments? If we have stock assessments that may be missing catch, they may be missing some natural mortality, maybe the natural mortality assumption is lower than the actual natural mortality, it produces these retrospective patterns. And just walking through that a bit, this is the most recently assessed Georges Bank yellowtail analytical stock assessment. And for example, if we go back to 2007, that assessment, when 2007 was the last year of the assessment, estimated the stock to be about 15,000 tons. When that was updated the next year, 2018, that estimate went down to about 10,000 tons. When another year of data was added, that went down again to about 5,000 tons. And the blue line here was that most recent assessment, where it's really about 20% of what it was initially estimated to be. And so, as you can imagine, that's going to be misleading to fishery management. And because of these problems, this assessment was rejected. It's now an empirical assessment. And what many assessments are doing is adjusting the most recent estimate, assuming that the same retrospective pattern is going to continue, and that estimate is going to be revised downward over time. So this is just a depiction of how these impacts on missing catch and missing natural mortality, the impacts that they can have on a stock assessment. So hopefully that sets up the problem well, and it leads to the next portion of this, which is management strategy evaluation. Many of you probably heard the phrase, and it's a tool that allows us to evaluate different management strategies and their robustness to problems like underreported catch and changes in productivity. And here's where I got to give a lot of credit to Lisa Kerr, who's led the analyses that I'll be talking about, and Mackenzie Mazur, who's done a lot of the heavy lifting and the coding for these. They've applied management strategy evaluation with a larger group of scientists to groundfish to try to address some of these problems. So if you're not familiar with management strategy evaluation, as I said, it's a tool that we can use to simulate fishery systems, to test alternative harvest strategies and management procedures to really see if they are expected to meet our management objectives. And one of the approaches here is testing management procedures and simulation to see if they're expected to achieve objectives. And if they don't meet objectives in simulation, they're probably not going to meet objectives in reality as well. So I'll walk through the components of this. The first really is kind of just a simulated reality. We simulate a fish population with all of the components of productivity. The simulated fish grow, and they mature, and they make babies the next year. And so we have a full population dynamics model. That interacts with a fishery model where there are removals. The fishery has size selectivity, age selectivity, imposes fishing mortality back on the population. And so we have this dynamic model of a fish population and a fishery, and the fishery can be complex. There can be recreational fleets and commercial fleets. And so we have either a simple or a complex fish and fishery model, which we term the operating model. What we'll do from this virtual reality is simulate the typical data that we invest in. So we can simulate surveys, whether it's the MASS survey or the Northeast Fishery Science Center trawl survey. It can index the true abundance in our operating model. And it can be either a noisy survey or it can be a really precise survey. We can also simulate fishery data. And we can simulate noisy fishery data. We can simulate biased fishery data, where the reported catch is less than the actual catch. And those all feed into a stock assessment. So we have our fishery dependent data for a time series of removals and age composition. We have time series of surveys and their age composition. And that all goes into a stock assessment model. For these applications, we use an age-based model, a statistical catch at age, similar to that for Gulf of Maine cod, which outputs a time series of stock sizes like the ones I've been showing. Once we have an estimate of stock size, that can feed into a harvest control rule. This is a fairly generic harvest control rule that's somewhat precautionary. It sets the target fishing mortality at 75% of the overfishing limit, or the fishing mortality at maximum sustainable yield. When the stock is overfished, or when the stock goes to less than 50% of the stock size associated with maximum sustainable yield, there's some reduction in the target fishing mortality. And so this is required by Magnuson. And so this ramped harvest control rule emulates what we do for groundfish, fishing them at 75% FMSY when the stock's healthy, and then reducing the target fishing mortality when the stocks are overfished. And the closed loop aspect of management strategy evaluation is that these harvest control rule decisions are then implemented back on the simulated fishery. And so the catch is limited based on the catch advice, and that affects the fish population. And that produces another year of survey and fishery data. And that process is repeated over and over for these management strategy evaluations. We ran this for 30 years, where the simulation is producing new data, updating the stock assessment every other year, implementing a harvest control rule, and that harvest control rule advice is then imposed on the fishery for another time sequence. So hopefully that gives you at least a high-level conceptual overview of what management strategy evaluation is doing. And over the last few years, this approach has been applied to several aspects of groundfish science and management. The catch bias simulations were done with Lisa as the lead there. More recently, alternative harvest control rules were evaluated, with Mackenzie taking the lead. And Lisa and I and a larger group are about to use the same approach to evaluate alternative management procedures that account for cod population structure. And that's in progress, but I'll touch on the general approach that we'll be using there. So let's start with the catch bias simulations. So the first thing we have is a time series of conditioning in the operating model. So this is not coincidentally the same time period as the Gulf of Maine cod stock assessment. And also not coincidentally, it's got the same time series of recruitment and fishing mortality. We essentially conditioned the operating model on the Gulf of Maine cod stock assessment. So it has the same historical productivity, the same historical stock sizes and catch. But now what we're going to do is simulate forward a management procedure, and in this case, 4 different scenarios using a harvest control rule that I showed, where we fish it 75% FMSY when the stock's healthy. We have a ramped decrease in target fishing mortality when the stock size goes below half BMSY. In the 4 scenarios here are no catch bias at all in green, up to 200% catch bias in red. And if we look at the trajectories of stock size during that management procedure, when there's no bias in catch, we get the expected rebuilding that we saw for scallops and haddock and others, that when we reduce fishing mortality, we expect the stock to rebuild back toward BMSY, which is what the green trajectory shows here, and effectively limiting fishing mortality. And in the long run, producing near maximum sustainable yield. When we go to the other extreme of extreme catch bias of 200%, we don't get that rebuilding. We get some initial increase, but we really fail to meet our rebuilding objectives because we're fishing at too high a rate, because the actual catch is much greater than the reported catch, or the catch we think we're controlling. The fishing mortality is greater than the overfishing definition. So we're not meeting our rebuilding. And we have 2 intermediates here of 50% bias and 125% bias, where 50% bias has rebuilding, not quite to the levels of the no bias and the intermediate as well. So now we're going to add on, in addition to catch bias, increasing natural mortality. Fortunately for Gulf of Maine cod, we do have 2 stock assessments, one that has a constant natural mortality assumption, the other that has a changing, increasing natural mortality assumption. So we're able to condition our simulations on those. When we run the management procedure, simulate that forward, the top graphs are what we just saw before with just catch bias. The bottom graphs now have catch bias and increasing natural mortality. So even the no catch bias scenario does not rebuild. And we see that, for the moderate to high catch biases, none of them are rebuilding because they're all producing fishing mortalities that are higher than expected. And the productivity of the stock doesn't allow for the rebuilding because of the misspecified natural mortality. Moving on to harvest control rules, I showed the ramped harvest control rule in the upper left, where we fish at about 75% FMSY when the stock size is high, and then the target fishing mortality ramps down when it's lower. Here's another harvest control rule that emulates the current approach, is that we have our precautionary target fishing mortality at high stock size, and that steps down to a rebuilding fishing mortality. Something the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council applies is what we call a probabilistic approach, or a P-star approach, where we have the statistical uncertainty in the overfishing limit, and we have a risk tolerance decision based on the percentile of that distribution, and we have an acceptable catch that's based on a lower percentile of that estimate of the overfishing limit. And then the 4th harvest control rule we have is essentially the ramped harvest control, but with a constraint on variation in catch from year to year. So rather than jumping down in your target fishing mortality, your catch is constrained so that it doesn't change too much from year to year. So those are the 4 alternative harvest control rules that were performance tested. I'll start with the left plot here, which is a time series looking at the spawning stock relative to the rebuilding target, BMSY. and fishing mortality relative to the FMSY overfishing limit. So all four of these harvest control rule options start in the same biomass. So they all started with a 2019 stock size, but then applied these four different harvest control rules. And I'll walk through a couple of them. The first is the F step is the simplest one, where we have a slightly lower fishing mortality when the stock is low, but that fishing mortality is kept constant through the rebuilding period. It effectively rebuilds the stock. So the stock is rebuilt at the end of the time series, and the fishing mortality goes up a bit once it rebuilds to 75% FMSY. So that is the harvest control rule is performing as expected to effectively rebuild the stock and avoid overfishing. We have two what I'll call precautionary control rules. We have the ramp harvest control rule and the probabilistic harvest control rule. They were specified to have about the same level of precaution. So as expected, they perform similarly. They both have a fairly low fishing mortality at the beginning of the management procedure period. But then as the stock rebuilds, it allows for higher and higher fishing mortality. And similar to the F-step harvest control rule, they both achieve rebuilding in this medium term. The most complicated one here is the constrained ramp, which starts at a fairly high fishing mortality, in fact, right at the overfishing limit. Because of the constraint is that the harvest control rule doesn't allow the fishing mortality to drop down so quickly as these other ones. But then over time, the fishing mortality is decreased, which effectively rebuilds the stock. But as the stock increases, the fishing mortality is not allowed to increase because of that same constraint. And so really rebuilds to a very high stock. But over the long term, all four of these harvest control rules really end up in about the same place, is that they all effectively rebuild the stock. They take different routes to get there, but they all rebuild the stock and they avoid overfishing during that management procedure period. So that's all pretty good. We have three precautionary harvest control rules that are expected to rebuild the stock in principle, and in this simulation testing, they do. But now let's simulate climate impacts in a misspecified stock assessment. So here we have the same starting conditions for those four different scenarios. We have the F step, which now immediately allows overfishing because we have the climate impacts going on in the stock. And it doesn't allow for rebuilding. It never gets into the green zone. And the same with these others. They all eventually produce overfishing, and none of them allow the stock to rebuild. And so even though these are all precautionary control rules, they don't perform well for effectively allowing the stock to rebuild or avoiding overfishing. So really a quick pass on these is that in the catch bias scenarios, improved catch reporting as expected, improved the stock assessment and helped achieve rebuilding. The high bias in catch was detrimental to sustainable management. It didn't allow the stock to rebuild at all. Moderate bias had more limited impacts. It did allow for some rebuilding, and it didn't allow for overfishing, but it didn't have the high performance of the no bias catch as well. For the harvest control rule simulations, not accounting for increased natural mortality and the retrospective patterns that result from them cause negative impacts on management to the point where we can't expect rebuilding if we have these retrospective patterns caused by a misspecification. So those were the take homes from those management strategy evaluations on catch bias and harvest control rules. The next step for this approach is using management strategy evaluation to try to evaluate alternatives for managing cod. Our current spatial management units are a Gulf of Maine management unit and a Georges Bank management unit that includes the Eastern Georges Bank transboundary management unit with Canada, as well as parts of this, Southern New England. Over the last few decades, we've had a lot of research on cod population structure using genetics and tagging and early life history dispersal, otolith chemistry and microstructure, and have found that the population structure of cod is much more complex than these management units reflect. In fact, we've found that we have genetically distinct stocks on eastern Georgia's bank, then inshore stocks, a genetically distinct stock in southern New England, two overlapping populations in the western Gulf of Maine of the winter spawners and spring spawners, and then eastern Gulf of Maine also appears to be a separate population, and all of them separate than Scotian shelf cod. So we recognize that in principle, we want our spatial management units to reflect the spatial population structure. Our current management unit scenario doesn't reflect those. And so what we need to do is simulation test the current management procedure as well as some alternatives. So the alternatives that we're considering, we just finished a series of workshops with scientists and fishermen and managers trying to discuss the pros and cons of different approaches going forward. And we've kind of narrowed it down to these different scenarios. The first scenario is status quo, is that we have, I'm going to back up one slide, we have an operating model that simulates this complex population structure, with each population having independent population dynamics. Within these independent populations, we allow for seasonal mixing of these different populations, and we use that operating model to test these different management procedures. The status quo management procedure would be simulating data for a Georgia's bank stock assessment, the Gulf of Maine stock assessment, run those stock assessments, have our current harvest control rules to see how this paradigm performs in the context of complex spatial populations. A different management unit scenario would be simply an offshore Georgia's bank cod management unit and an inshore stock complex, again simulating data from these 5 different populations to support an eastern Georgian bank assessment, an inshore cod complex assessment to see how that performs for rebuilding cod, for avoiding overfishing. We can split out southern New England to see if that improves the performance of management, and we can split out eastern Gulf of Maine as well to see if that improves management. And then within the western Gulf of Maine, we can do things like stock composition sampling the otoliths to see if they're winter spawners or spring spawners. And so we can decide this on principle that, in principle, we want our management units to reflect the biological population structure. But in practice, we need to know if doing that will actually improve management. Does a more complex management procedure like this outperform the current management procedure? In principle, using best science available and managing stocks as a unit, we probably should be doing this, but we don't know if the data we collect will support that or if the added complexity actually improves the performance. So we'll be doing this over the next few years, and we anticipate that the results from this will be incorporated into the research track assessment for cod that's scheduled for 2023, and it's actually just ramping up this year. And I'll really close with that, is that really, I think the lesson from those management strategy evaluations is that we can't expect management to improve until we can improve our stock assessments so that they don't have these retrospective patterns, so that they account for changes in productivity. There's been a few, so we've recently transitioned to a research track stock assessment process. The first one that I was involved in here was Red Hake, where we actually looked at the spatial shifts that were consistent with climate change and confirmed the stock boundaries. Also developed a survey-based assessment using survey trawl efficiency. Haddock research track assessments are happening now. There are things happening there like considering process error in different stock assessment models that could help to evaluate some of these problems like catch bias and environmental influences. The American Place research track assessments is exploring climate impacts on both recruitment and depth distribution, and how that change in depth distribution affects the catchability of trawl surveys like the MASS survey and the NOAA surveys. And as I said, with cod, we're in the process of exploring alternative spatial units, but there will also be terms of reference for climate impacts. And so we really are relying on these research track assessments to give us the next generation stock assessment that are accounting for climate influences, accounting for uncertainties in catch, so that we can provide the best basis for fishery management with the data we have available to us. So really wrapping it up, going back to the question, what's up with New England groundfish? I think we need to recognize that fishery management has been effective for several stocks. Some stocks have rebuilt, just as the models expected after the fishery management actions, both the closed areas, the increased mesh sizes, initially the reductions in days at sea, and more recently, the expectations with annual catch limits. When it comes to redfish, pollock, haddock, they appear to have responded just as expected. Others have not. Cod and many flatfish haven't responded to those extremely low catch limits. Underreported catch, climate change are some of the culprits that we're looking at that are impacting both stock assessment and effective fishery management. I think the management strategy evaluations have showed us that it's an effective tool so that we can evaluate the robustness of the management procedure, both the stock assessment and the harvest control rule, the climate change and uncertainty through those series of catch monitoring, harvest control rules, spatial management units. Each of those can be evaluated using this tool to try to evaluate what are our best expectations moving forward, what are our best approaches to data collection, our best approaches to stock assessments, and our best approaches to management, precaution, and uncertainty. And so we're really relying on these research track assessments to improve the basis for fisheries management. And really, we shouldn't expect that the status of New England groundfish will improve until we can improve those stock assessments. So with that, I'll just thank all the people who shared in the input to these management strategy evaluations and my perspectives on groundfish, starting with the groundfish fishermen. Worked with lots of scientists and fishery managers over the years in developing these. The analytical teams for the management strategy evaluations, funding from the New England Council, NOAA, SINAR, NOAA COCA program, and we've had a lot of feedback from stakeholders, scientists, managers in these New England management strategy evaluations, including the Science and Statistical Committee and the center leads, John DeRova, Sarah Geikus as well. So Gary, thanks a lot. I hope that gives us time for some questions and discussion.